Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Law and Legitimacy. It's Thursday. Had to stop and think about what day it is. That's a bad sign. About 90 minutes from now, maybe a little bit more, I'll be on my feet in the Connecticut Appellate Court arguing the Alex Jones appeal of the $1.5 billion judgment in the Sandy Hook case. But of course, that's not the appeal you came here to hear about. Let's talk first about the one that everybody will be watching, and that is the Donald Trump appeal involving disqualification. The potential disqualification of him from office. There was a fascinating piece in Politico this morning that you know talked about 6 questions that need to be addressed or that will be addressed in the argument. I read through it and I thought it's a decent way to frame the issue and chop it up. And I thought we'd spend a moment just going through it. 6 arguments. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, as you know by now, says that a person who engages in or supports insurrection or rebellion, having previously sworn an oath to defend the Constitution and support the Constitution, rather, is ineligible for office unless Congress gives him a pass, and Congress won't in this case. So, question: does that apply to Trump, and if so, how? Trump's people first argue that Trump is not an officer within the meaning of the law, and therefore he can't be held accountable in any way under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I think the court will make short work of that argument. The argument rejecting the decision rejecting his immunity claims in the D.C. Circuit earlier this week shed some light on why. We wouldn't have a president but for the Constitution. The Constitution describes the role of the presidency, and that can be regarded as an office within the meaning of the law. So I don't expect the court to linger long on that, and I suspect the court will reject that unanimously. 6, was there an insurrection? Insurrection, at least in our current dictionary, means some sort of violent uprising against authority or government. It probably meant more or less the same thing at the time that the 14th Amendment was amended. However, here's where I expect the court to begin to fray and give divided opinions. Some people will say that when you look at the contemporary meaning of the word, in other words, the original understanding of insurrection at the time the 14th Amendment was drafted, it applied to people who had taken up arms against the United States in some sort of organized effort to destroy the United States, either by succession or otherwise. And in that instance, it would be confined to acts much like the Civil War, and that would be the meaning of insurrection. It wouldn't mean a protest turned violent. So I expect there to be some division on that issue. Third, did Trump engage in insurrection if there were an insurrection? Again, a closer argument. Clearly, he used speech that riled up the crowd. Did he incite the crowd? Did he to engage in violence? Some will argue he did. Some will argue that he used hortatory speech that the crowd reacted to. Again, I expect a split decision there. The fourth argument is one we haven't talked about here, and I think it actually could be the winning argument. The 14th Amendment has 5 sections, and like other civil rights amendments and or Civil War amendments or Reconstruction amendments, the 5th clause is the so-called enabling clause, and it gives Congress the ability to enact such laws as are necessary to give a force and effect to the other rights guaranteed in the amendment. And so I think this goes to the heart of the matter, and that matter being, what process do we use? How do we determine who decides whether a president engaged in insurrections? Do secretaries of individual states, do clerks in the secretaries of states, do juries, do judges? Those who argue that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is self-executing invite a world of chaos where every cranky Uncle Bob who's got a job in a state election office can make constitutionally significant decisions depriving people of their right to vote for a candidate. I think the court will provide procedural guidance and rely on Section 5 and suggest that further process is necessary and that Congress needs to act.
I want to stop for just a moment, and because this is a political article, we know the bias that it brings to the table. But I just can't help but to continue pointing out when um, media sources and again the reason that we're even in this scenario right now with Trump and the Colorado Supreme Court ruling is because there was an NGO that actually used in principal part the House Select Committee on January 6th findings to buttress the lawsuit to persuade the lower court that there was an insurrection and that Trump had indeed engaged in insurrection. And I just take great exception to the sentences like the one I have highlighted here. And evidence gathered by House Jan 6 committee indicated that Trump knew some of those who came to his speech had firearms. What the hell is that even about, Norm?
I read the J6 report. I don't recall that. I think that there were intelligence reports that there may be armed people coming. I don't know what it mean. I'm not sure that I sat through a long trial in the Proud Boys case, and the J6 report, for example, claimed that Joe Biggs had a confrontation with an individual where Joe brandished a firearm. We all knew that to be untrue. And the jury was prohibited from hearing that because there was no evidence to support it. Yet the January 6th committee reported that someone was threatened with a firearm. The January 6th committee report is not, it's a public record, and it may be independently admissible under the laws of evidence as a public record, but it's not reliable in my view, as a document that reports historic truths about the president's involvement in January 6th, because it's almost like Liz Cheney's book. It's an impassioned piece of it's an impassioned polemic that is designed to affix responsibility for the event on the president's shoulder, and was almost a prelude to the impeachment that took place almost immediately after the president left, or after the event. The I finished yesterday Ben Hamilton's book on January 6th, and he made an interesting argument, and that is that there's a lot of and I'm referring obviously to hey, sorry guys, we stopped the Capitol. We stormed the Capitol. Ben Hamilton is an independent reporter, former history teacher who's taken to the streets to interview people about our times, because he wants to provide a record for the world going forward, so that everybody knows just what happened in this country at that time. And his view is that right now everybody's chasing narratives. That's how he puts it. But he regards January 6th as a perfect storm of stupidity. A stupid group of people got together thinking they could magically change the course of the country without a plan. A stupid group of law enforcement didn't prepare for an event they knew they were coming. Stupid politicians have tried to make claims about the event that aren't supported by the fact. And really, just what happened was this perfect storm of people with bad and false and ridiculous expectations, and a disaster. And it's no more than that. But history is such that we have to tell stories with morals, and therefore we try to politicize it in the way that Colorado did, in the way the House J6 report did. Um, Going back to the Politico piece, the fifth point is, what do parties have a First Amendment? Political parties have a First Amendment right to put their candidates of choice up, and if the disqualification clause is given full force and effect, are those rights abridged? And I think that argument is not persuasive. The fact of the matter is, the 14th Amendment is part of the Constitution as well as the First Amendment, and there's no sophisticated balancing test to be engaged in here. If the First Amendment guarantees people freedom of expression, and another amendment says, but some people can't occupy office, you harmonize those two, and it's not really that difficult. The sixth argument is whether the 14th Amendment was just about the Civil War. And I think that that's a fascinating argument that's going to put originalists to the test. And I think the originalists will lose there. Yes, the 14th Amendment was enacted in response to the Civil War, but nothing in the language of it makes it a backward looking document. I think it looked forward, and the language that it offers is language of general applicability and can be applied in our time. So when you look at these six arguments, what am I saying? I'm saying if I were a justice of the Supreme Court, I would strike down Colorado's act. I would claim that the that the 14th Amendment it has a meaning that is independently applicable in our time, and that it requires a fact finder to determine whether there was an insurrection, whether a person engaged in that insurrection within the meaning of the law, and that what we need in order to vindicate the rights of all is some independent process to determine how that happens. And under Section 5, it's Congress's role to determine what that process should be. Therefore, Trump should remain on the ballot. Let's kick the can down the road for further developments.
I'd sometimes sit and wonder, as I am right now, Norm, what the people that write certain things really, what esteem they hold about themselves. Look at what I've got on the screen here. This is the very last paragraph or sentence in the Politico article. Quote, "The remarkable similarity of the threats and violence precipitating Trump's insurrection to similar attacks in the South during the Reconstruction is an uncanny but important indication that Section 3 remains relevant and important to the protection of our republic," Howard Law professor Sherilyn Ifill wrote in a Friend of the Court brief.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I was in the appellate court the other day arguing about the applicability of expert testimony to determine racial animus in a civil suit, and my adversary stood up and used the first 7 minutes of his rebuttal argument to quote Bob Marley. Haile Selassie, former emperor of Ethiopia, to read from W.E.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, Baldwin, James Baldwin. And I just looked at the justices and I looked at the kid and I thought, what are you doing? You're giving, and I turned up when it was my turn to give my reply to his rebuttal. And I said, whatever else learned counsel did here in this court today, he wasn't involved in legal argument. And Eiffel's Friend of the Court brief is a political screed. Analogy is the crutch of idiots. If you want to dislike something and you can liken it to something everyone dislikes, well, then you've proven your point. But an analogy is often bad history. I don't know who Eiffel is. I'm surprised that Politico gave her the time of day. She's had her 15 minutes of fame. Now sit down and shut up, Professor. As to Alex, I want to talk briefly about the Alex Jones appeal, which I will be arguing inside of 2 hours. We're going to raise a number of issues there today. You'll recall that Alex was found liable for engaging in tortious conduct with respect to parents of surviving parents of decedents at the Sandy Hook school shooting in 2012, I think it was, awarded the jury awarded the plaintiffs $1.5 billion in damages, a result we found shocking. So we intend to ask the appellate court to send the case back for a new trial on 4 grounds. Well, 5, but the 4 that I'll talk about today is whether the default entered against Alex Jones, that is whether the trial court, when it decided to take away his right to defend itself, engaged in a disproportionate remedy. The trial court felt that assumed that Alex and found that Alex had not fully complied with his discovery obligations under the civil process, and concluded that a default was warranted because the plaintiffs had been unable to prove fully their case. Our view is that a default should only be entered when a person refuses to participate at all. If there were defects in Alex's performance, there were ways juries could have been informed of that. The plaintiffs could have had asked for a spoliation count to be added. That is a claim that Jones willfully made evidence unavailable, and then a jury could have been asked what to do about that. Jurors could have been told to draw adverse inferences as against Jones and his team as a result of failure to comply with things. But in the end, it should have been a jury decision, and that in entering a default, in other words, in imposing the civil death penalty, the court treated Jones like a murderer when he was really just a trespasser. In terms of a second issue, the court relieved the plaintiffs of the responsibility to prove causation. And even though there was a default and causation had been established as a matter of law, the case law is clear that a plaintiff must prove the extent of their damages, even in a hearing in damages, which is what that trial became, in order to get any money. And the trial court relieved the plaintiffs of that. Third, the damages in this case were shocking to the conscience. The plaintiffs presented no medical evidence. They presented no experts about the extent of their emotional distress. What they did is talked about how deeply upsetting the publicity was and the steps they had to take to avoid being exposed to harassment as a result, they claimed, of Mr. Jones's speech and conduct. But how a guy gets $90 million as a retired FBI agent did because Mr. Jones said he looked like one of the plaintiff's fathers and he was therefore a crisis actor. It shocks the conscience and should shock the judicial conscience, which is the standard. The plaintiffs gave essentially punitive damages arguments in a compensatory damages case, telling the jury at the beginning of the case and at the end they had to stop Mr. Jones. That's a punitive damages concept that is inapplicable in a compensatory damage concept or context rather. Fourth and finally, Jones was hit for about $450 million in damages for violating the Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act. That is an act that's designed to protect consumers from unscrupulous trade practices, including false advertising. It was used on behalf of some of the Sandy Hook families against Remington for the claim that they mismarketed their weapons grade firearms, their military grade firearms, to troubled teens, and this resulted in a school shooting. That's different from Mr. Jones saying the world's on fire. Buy my health nutritional supplements so that you can survive the cataclysm. This was Mr. Jones did not engage in false advertising. He may have made false claims, but they weren't about products. They were about public events. And using a statute that is designed to protect us against unscrupulous advertising against free speech is a dangerous precedent. So, that'll be the argument today. Each side gets 20 minutes. A lot of huffing and puffing will go on. The families will be present, I presume, in the courtroom. I don't think it's a media event. I think all eyes will be on Washington. I can't wait for the argument to be over so that I can come back to my office and read how the Trump argument went. But wish us well, and we'll get a decision sometime in the next 3 to 6 months, is my hunch. So
Let's talk about the border a little bit here.
yeah, what up with that? Is
Well,
this a little bit of congressional, is this a little bit of a administration extortion? Is this not playing directly into Governor Greg Abbott's hands? Oh, we can't patrol the border enough because you're not giving us money. So we're going to, the federal government says. So ICE is saying we're going to have to reduce our operations at the border because of lack of federal funds. Congress isn't giving us enough money to do our jobs. So the federal government is basically saying we have we have power here. Our power preempts that of the states, and it is our responsibility to secure the border, but we can't do it because we haven't been given enough money. So isn't Greg Abbott then justified in saying if you can't, we will?
or if you won't, right? I mean, so Biden has been bumbling around all week, in and out of ice cream parlors, stammering over, you know, giving the wrong names of people he's never met, or, wrong timelines of, certain historical events, alleged historical events. And what's interesting is I was listening to one of these many ramblings of his, and he makes the statement that Congress just needs to pass a law.
Hmm.
Just needs to pass a law, just pass the law, just pass the law. And I'm Norm, I almost respect how politically savage a position that is to take from a president that in his first month of his presidency issued how many executive orders,
Yeah,
and
I know.
how many of which have been overturned by the courts on judicial review, and 3 years into his term has presided over the biggest faux pas on the issue of immigration and enforcement of existing laws in the history of our country. And his position is Congress just needs to pass a law. Just
Yeah.
pass a law, right?
Just give me what I want or I'll take what you need, right?
It's amazing. And again, here we are with the Ukraine topic beginning to rear its head again. It really does beg the question as to what is going on within the halls of our elected leaders, within our elected government, in any branch, right? But primarily in Congress and in the executive branch. Norm,
Well,
what
the
is
answer
going
is
on that these elected leaders have been able to absorb and aggregate this much political influence and power and hang on to it long enough to just extort the American public for more and more and more that goes nowhere except to places that we have no connection to.
Well, we get the government we deserve, and this is what we tolerate, and therefore this is what we get. Congress, I mean, the metaphor of the swamp, yeah, fine. I'd call it more of the metaphor of the circling drain. These are people who appear to be swirling down a sinkhole and grabbing as much as they can before the tub empties. I mean, I know we didn't plan on talking about this, Mike, but you ask what's going on in Congress, and what's going on in our institutions where we get this gamesmanship devoid of any lively sense of American interest. And we have this sense of institutions in decay and collapse while real needs are being unmet. Enter from stage right, I guess we'll say, Vladimir Putin. You and I kicked around briefly what's going on with the Tucker interview. And here, I'm going to go out on a limb and make a prediction about Putin's interview. I think Putin's interview with Tucker, should it be shown, I don't doubt for a moment that there are furious efforts going on in Washington to prevent it from being shown, that Tucker's been contacted, I suspect, by Justice Department folks who are going to suggest that airing that interview might be a violation of some federal law, whether it be providing material support to terrorists, whether Putin's Russia has been designated an antagonist on some registry such that doing anything that gives him aid and comfort, to use that expression, might be deemed treasonous or seditious or otherwise against American interest, and expose Tucker to sanctions. I suspect there's a lot of research going on about that and some bluffing and some huffing and puffing. Let's say Tucker does show the interview. What's at stake? So, given, those of us of a certain age, that is, who grew up during the Cold War, have acquired a historical residue of distrust about Russia. I sometimes, when I want to talk about Russia, I find myself saying the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union dissolved years ago, and now we're left with an independent set of republics, Russia being chief among them. And what's the ideology that drives Russia, and why is Russia regarded as a threat to the West right now? And it goes to an old source of conflict between Russia and the West, the pan-Slavic view, that there is an alternative viewpoint to Western democratic tradition that is antagonistic to the Western democratic tradition, and that's pan-Slavism. And you see intimations of the conflict between pan-Slavism and the West in the writings of Dostoevsky or 19th century Russian intellectuals. Westernizers were regarded as people who were somehow corrupting the values of the pan-Slavic people, as reflected in part by the Russian Orthodox Church. So here's Vladimir Putin at the head of the Russian state, um, acting from within the midst of the rubble of what was once the Soviet Empire, looking for ideological inspiration. And some of the intellectuals around him are rabid pan-Slavists. And they take a Slavocentric view of the world and are therefore hostile to the West. And so they want to get more influence in Western Europe to protect themselves from Western European and Western democratic influences. The pan-Slavic ideology has certain echoes with American populism. It harkens back to a traditional moralistic framework to the degree that pan-Slavism has some reliance on the Russian Orthodox tradition. So American populism has a reliance on certain notions about the Christian tradition. I think what Vladimir Putin is doing with this interview is incredibly shrewd. He's going to try to transform pan-Slavism into a critique of decadent Westernism to appeal to American populists. And he has to be careful how he does it, because he doesn't want to reawaken the Soviet bugbear, the suspicions of Russia. He doesn't want to make a direct anti-Western appeal to Americans because we are in the West. But I think what he'll do is he'll hold up a mirror to the United States and say, look in that mirror, and do you recognize yourself? Do you recognize your values in a woke culture, in diversity for diversity's sake, in a swirling ethos of bathtub gin draining down and going down the drain when you can't articulate common visions of self, when you can't embrace excellence for excellence sake, where every difference has to be cherished because somehow everybody's feeling hurt is hurt and everybody gets a medal? You know better. There is a right and a good way to live. And I think he's going to try to stir that pot in the United States and somehow pull off an ideological miracle wherein he and some version of pan-Slavism become appealing to people looking for a new middle ground in American life. Do I think that Vladimir Putin's going to try to become president, or that he's going to invade the United States? No, but he's going to engage in some ideological swordplay with middle America. And what he's going to say is, your elites and your institutions have failed you. And I understand why they've failed you. Here's why. And here's what you can do about it. Now, whether that directly involves support for Putin and his ambitions against the Ukraine, I don't know. But I think his version of pan-Slavic nationalism will be reworked and presented to the American people as an energy field that they can gravitate around and find a way out of the morass that cripples us and makes possible our being led by the sort of automatons that Mike mentioned first, the sort of corrupt people without vision who can't even accomplish basics such as protecting our borders. And so expect a lot from the Putin interview. I think this is likely to be the most significant social, political, cultural event of 2024. And I say that knowing full well that this is an election year. It's going to reawaken claims about Russian influence in the United States. It will align with some of Trump's rhetoric, which is, becoming a little tired at this point. He needs new inspiration. He needs a new source of energy. I think that Vladimir Putin's going to try to stir up the 2024 electoral process, and I think he's got a better than even chance of doing so. So stay tuned on that interview. I think it's going to be explosive stuff.
T Girl and It's Me Again on Rumble are informing us, Norm, that the interview is supposed to be published this evening. We
Oh, wow.
don't know a time, but T is saying that the interview will be released today on Tucker's site. It's Me Again is saying that 6 p.m., but we're looking to verify, saying that the time is on tuckercarlson.com. So we'll check that after. It looks like in either case, today is the day. And what I would say regarding the pan-Slavism version of your comments there, Norm, is that that may be okay to the extent that most of America is historically illiterate at this point anyway. In fact, that's something that I um, I talk a lot about being a major problem in terms of our, civic a command of basic civics and a certain required level of nationalism and pride and what it means to be an American citizen. The dignity that flows therefrom and the confidence that young people need to take on the world and find courage to look at themselves honestly. I think that what I would say to Tucker's sort of opening that Pandora's box is a version of what I offered yesterday, which is there are going to be obvious consequences. And there's a reason that, despite there being some frenzied energy around, trying to delegitimize the interview before it's published, in terms of our, federal Department of Justice and the federal law enforcement agencies and surveillance agencies, it appears as though, all is quiet right now, very intentionally. So to your point, it's possible that, in this momentary pause before the interview is published, that that these intelligence agencies and the Department of Justice and others are working to figure out how to turn Tucker Carlson into the next Julian Assange or the next Edward Snowden.
I
Um,
think that's probably right. And I think that's exactly right.
so, in I don't like that because I think that Tucker plays a very valuable role in where we are as a country right now in terms of getting back on track and enlightening people. He is extraordinarily historically inclined in terms of a factual basis. He talks openly about how he is barely religious, right, by comparison to some of the more fundamentalist religions. But one thing that is clear to me is that the elites in America, the American elite, right, public, private, the American elite have for a long time enjoyed the attribution of moral authority, sort of a monolithic moral authority to conduct American interests abroad from the citizens, right, on behalf of the citizens. But it's had that moral authority given to it and attributed to it by the citizens. It's clear to me that if there's any tool in Vladimir Putin's toolbox that will awaken the American spirit, it will be a combination of the younger demographics' historical disconnect from the Cold War, from the Soviet Union, um, and it will be the observation that that moral authority is completely gone.
Mm,
And
well,
that's
let's
an
see.
appeal to something greater than the law, right? What
Yeah.
I'm speaking about is the architecture of law, the foundations of things like natural law and moral authority that America is founded upon, right? And what Putin has done is absolutely turn its country back onto the gold standard, right? And away from the fractional reserve, crude backed currency that the US dollar has become, right? And so that presents a real legitimate and existential danger when it comes to things like BRICS, other competing currencies and alliances on the world stage. So when Tucker talks in his video about this being a watershed moment in world history, that alliances are changing in a material way and in ways that the average American does not see and cannot understand until it's made abundantly clear. That's the importance of this interview.
Oh, I
It,
think so, and I think that one of the subtexts in Putin's message will be, you know, in your heart, ye people in Western Europe and the United States, that your mission has collapsed and is collapsing on its own. You
this
need
is
an alternative way to go. You need an alternative view, and here is one. You know.
And Don's right. Don, you were absolutely right about this, and I think this is what I was attempting to say in different words on yesterday's stream to Norm. This is my concern is that even if what Tucker is doing is right, even the connection even if he's able to make that sort of metaphysical connection to the leader that Putin is and the absolute state of the modern West and where the West should want to be from a moral perspective, it's not going to make it won't be without significant consequences in the real world,
Well,
socially, economically, and legally.
it's going to be an interesting interview, and I look forward to it. So, listen, Mike, I gotta run. I gotta get up to the appellate court to seek justice on behalf of Alex
Talk
Jones.
about beer at some point. I know I purposely kind of do this, I think, at this point, but I'll write about it. But for the sake of argument, I'll just say, Norm, before you get out of here, I think that Trump putting his support behind Anheuser-Busch is a very politically savvy move. I also think that those that are hanging tight to the principle of not wanting to buy Bud Light are doing a major disservice and advocating for the financial ruin of those that they might not know align with them politically because of the nature of what the beer industry is, how it's regulated, and the sheer scale of what Anheuser-Busch is as a global company. So anyway, we'll talk more about that. I'll definitely write about it, but we'll talk about that tomorrow as well.
Dos vidania, folks. That's appropriate given the fact that we'll be listening to Vladimir tonight. It's until next time, or goodbye, or see you tomorrow. Dos vidania. Thank you for listening to Law and Legitimacy.
The most epic would be if Tucker signed off by saying AMF yo-yo.
Where do people find us, Mike?
At LawPod Daily on X. That'll do the trick.
All right. Ciao. Talk to you soon, Bo.